I'm Catherine Arndt, the Chief of the VLGA Connect Studio. Welcome to today's episode, brought to you by the VLGA, your councillor support network and the national broadcaster on all things local government.
Hello everyone, it's TGU time. That stands for the Governance Update from VLGA Connect, sponsored by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers. And with us this week to unpack the week's local government news is Nick Miller from Hunt and Hunt. Hello, Nick.
Hi, Chris. How are you going?
Very well, thank you, and good to see you. And Julie Reid is with us as well, as usual. Hi, Julie.
Hi, Chris. Great to see you both this week. We have a jam-packed episode ahead of us, I see. So
We do.
we're very excited.
Lots to talk about.
Yeah, and we're all wishing that we were in Queensland at the moment because we're stuck in Melbourne. So maybe if we could relocate to Queensland next week, Chris, that would be lovely, and then we can get a bit of warmth.
I was going to say,
Melbourne
just because
winter.
the temperature is like twice what it is here in Melbourne. Is that what you're saying? Yeah,
exactly.
Yes. That has very much been noted on the nightly weather reports. I dare say a little bit warmer again wherever Tony Brownick is this week. He's gone suspiciously quiet, folks.
I know.
Good thing, bad thing, let the viewer decide.
Yes, indeed.
My suspicion is that he might be in Italia now. I don't know. I'm not too sure, but maybe enjoying too much good food, I suspect.
Could be, yes. Well, I'm sure we'll hear from him before too long. And also someone else we'll hear from later in the program is Rhys Thomas from the VLGA, another surprisingly interesting segment from Rhys about leaves of absence. You don't want to miss that. That's coming up. A few news stories in the media that we'll touch on this week. But firstly, it was, of course, the week of the King's Birthday Honours list, and a few local government people. I hesitate to use the word stalwart. I think it means the right thing. It just sounds like an ugly word, doesn't it? But some long-term local government contributors have been recognised, which is always nice to see, Julie.
Yeah, it certainly is, Chris. It's great to see these people that are being recognised. It's always great to see at least a couple of local government people coming forward. So, Chris, what does the list look like? Who's on it this time?
So, for the Victorian ones, the currently serving councillors, particularly of note, Margaret O'Rourke from the city of Greater Bendigo, has been a mayor there for 4 terms, of course, received the Medal of the Order of Australia, and the RCV chair and former mayor of Southern Grampians Council, Marianne Brown, has also become an OAM. Marianne is, of course, a current councillor at Southern Grampians. A couple of nice ones to note. Dr. David Zingier, who we noted passed not that long ago, was a councillor at Glen Ira Council. He's posthumously been made a member of the Order of Australia. We've got a former councillor and deputy mayor from the city of Kingston, Donna Hope, a Medal of the Order of Australia. Max Papley, formerly of Cardinia Shire. Elizabeth Jackson of the old Brunswick City Council. Some of the old names were coming out here. Carolyn Ingvarson of the former Camberwell Council. They've been recognised. Also, Emeritus Professor Michael Buxton, who was at the former council of Sherbrooke-shire. And I've got to say, Nick and Julie, that was a new one on me. I hadn't heard of Sherbrooke-shire before.
Yes, well, I remember it when I was a child, Chris, because
really?
lived in the Shire of Sherbrooke. I
there
remember
you go.
that.
There you go.
Yeah.
But he was also, I'm guessing it must be near what's known as the city of Mordialloc, or was at the time, because he served on that council as well. Are they nearby?
No, it's not.
He
It's
must
now
have relocated.
Yeah, it's sort of Knox Yarra Ranges area, sort of up in that Upwey, Tacoma, Belgrave area was the Shire of Sherbrooke.
Well, there you go.
There you go.
Learn something every week here on TGU.
Read.
Yes. So Michael Buxton, a member of the Order of Australia, quite a number of contributors around the country on the list, including a few recipients of the Public Service Medal. That includes the current CEO of Queensland's Burdekin Shire Council, Terry Brennan, and a director at Muswellbrook Shire, Sharon Pope, who's the Director of Environment and Planning. They both received a PSM. And Andrew McDonald from the town of Walkerville in South Australia can put PSM after his name as well. So that's
on the list.
Yes, indeed.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's fantastic. And I love seeing all of the excitement on LinkedIn when people get those accolades and when people make all those really positive comments about them. So it's really great to celebrate, Chris.
And there's probably more. It's not that easy to troll through the list and find the ones that are directly relevant. So if we have missed any, do let us know. We'd love to make sure they get a mention in a future episode. So that's the King's birthday list for this year. Now, a couple of stories in the press looking at the current state of local government in Victoria, and another one slightly more broadly across the country. The Age ran a story, Nick, basically summarising all of the councils in Victoria this term that have been undergoing some sort of intervention, whether that be being removed and replaced with administrators or having municipal monitors appointed. I've got to confess, I was reading through the story wondering what's the point here, but it just seems like a bit of a snapshot of a point in time, doesn't it?
Yes. Look, I think a few thoughts on this, Chris. It's a tale of woe to a certain degree, and the media's always got to put that sort of spin on things. I did find the Age article was a useful catalogue and snapshot, as you say. Standing back and thinking about it and thinking about why is this the case, we have to perhaps credit the fact that the local media, print media, which used to exist 10, 15 years ago, is just no longer there. They don't have a business model which has them putting journalists regularly into council meetings to attend and report on that. So there's that loss of information, loss of belonging, and accordingly that eventually leads to a loss of trust. And perhaps that's part of what's happening here. And I think if you think about the coverage that you used to get in the Glen Ira, the Leader, the Moonee Valley Leader, those newspapers used to cover local government pretty extensively. It's a different story, interestingly, in the larger regional cities. So Geelong, Ballarat and Bendigo, there is pretty much daily coverage of local government. So that's a good thing. In Melbourne, apart from the Age, at least, is covering Melbourne City Council, but it's not really covering what's going on in the suburbs. So there's quite minimal coverage there. And I think what this means is you're just getting ratepayers and communities that are in those suburban areas are just disconnected, disengaged. And of course, we know that in that sort of vacuum, disinformation and misinformation can travel fast, very fast, aided and abetted and inflamed indeed by social media. So that's the sort of thing that's happening there. A couple of other thoughts. When Greater Geelong City Council was coming out of administration 6, 7, 8 years ago, the state government ran a bit of an experiment, really, in this citizen jury idea to look at what structures might make sense, how many councillors, what would be the ward structure. That's a really interesting idea. You create a jury of 100 by randomly selecting people, and they can get expert advice, for example, from the VEC, the Electoral Commission, which is a really good idea. It hasn't been repeated. Maybe that's a sort of circuit breaker at how we can get the community engaged in local government again. But there are other things happening here. There's culture war stuff, unfortunately. That's never helpful. There's the NIMBYs and the YIMBYs. And of course, we know that can get pretty heated. We're seeing that fairly regularly. Also, the local government is seen by some as a political testing ground for those that are looking at a political career. And sometimes that can lead to displays of some immaturity, I think. There's the nihilists who come along and think, well, it's broken, so it doesn't matter how I behave. Looking at it from this angle, which is not the only angle to look at it, but if we had a Brisbane model where we had the whole metropolitan area in a single council area, then there would be a lot more attention on local government. I'm not saying that's going to work in a city the size of Melbourne or Sydney, but it's an interesting thought. And I think the more scrutiny we can have of local government, I would like to hope that these issues might reduce somewhat and we'd get better behaviour.
Yeah, interesting take, Nick. It sort of ties in with another story that was in the press this week. This one was in the Australian. It was an opinion piece, and it was looking at this trend that I think we've all got our eye on ahead of elections in New South Wales and Victoria later this year, of more extreme candidates in terms of their views running for not always making their views known, perhaps before getting elected, and we've had a few examples of that, particularly in Western Australia, and the likelihood of these people getting elected at council elections this year, it's got a few people worried.
True. Look, I think that article gave me the sense that it's relatively easy to find outliers here. There are 79 local government areas in Victoria alone, and each of those is going to have a certain number of councillors. So by the time you multiply it out, that's a large number of people. You're always going to have the odd misfit who's there to have a good time, not a useful time. I think you can beat these things up a little bit.
Yeah, well, the title of the story was Local Government Election Boredom, which is sort of what you've been hinting at there, Nick, in your comments, puts the cookers in the mix. And the cookers, I think, is a general term that they're using for these sort of extremist right-wing candidates and, movements like the My Place movement that have come to the fore in recent times. Are you worried about that, Julie?
I am a little bit worried, Chris, and I'm just wondering whether there's any connection between the fact that a lot of councils are going to single-member wards and how much change there's likely to be. My guess is with going to single-member wards for a lot of the councils, there'll be lots of change in their councillor makeup. And as a result of that, are there going to be more of these kind of extreme people that might rally around or get support from their local community, which is maybe not as large as, they might not need as many votes, who knows? But I just wonder whether there's going to be any connection to that, or whether there's going to be a lot of change this time and we're going to end up with these people that come in on that one agenda platform and because it's popular with a small amount of people within the community. I don't know. It's just a theory of mine. I think I'm going to be watching that to see whether my theory is true, that there's going to be lots of change. But anyway, and look, I think that, recently the press, as you talked about, that talks about the monitors going into local government, the behaviours, the relationships breaking down, the trouble at councils that has been publicised so much recently doesn't help, because it means that people are going to think they're going to come in and change it all. So I am a little bit concerned about it. But we've always, I suppose, to a certain extent, have had that problem where you'll get one or two that might come in for the wrong reasons. Whether or not there's more, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's a democratic process, isn't it?
Yeah.
It'll run
That's
its
right.
course. But I think the point you make about the single issue is a good one, because we've seen many examples of people running on a particular issue that they want to be able to influence by getting elected, and then they get frustrated because they're only
they
one of a
do.
number, and they need to get the support of colleagues to get anything changed, anything done. And I think that's what we've seen happen in Western Australia, and to some extent in South Australia, where some councillors have come in on these platforms, have not been able to get the changes through that they want because they're on the outer.
That's
and
right.
then they've either thrown up their hands in frustration and disengaged, or in the case of a couple in South Australia, been removed after a number of conduct breaches for not turning up to council meetings.
Or fighting between councillors because they're trying to, convince their colleagues to support them, and then there's tension between them. And we've seen in the report by The Age this week that there's been at least 36 internal arbitrations already in Victoria between fighting councillors. We've had 10 councillor conduct panel processes. And we've seen 8 councillors temporarily stood down. So, it's not. That's not good news.
It's not a great scorecard, is it? And
No.
I don't know how that compares, but it certainly feels like those numbers are well and truly up on previous terms.
But there have been a number of cases where those arbiters have said, does this really need to come to arbitration?
Yeah.
We should be dealing with these. There should be apologies behind the scenes, and there should be councils that are managing this internally before they go to that next step.
And it's about the induction process as well, isn't it, Chris? And making, sometimes you won't get through to some of these people, but one would hope that as part of an induction, they can come to understand that just ploughing a simple issue is really not going to work unless they engage more fully.
Yeah, look, it's something we could spend a lot more time on and bring some other voices into the discussion too, I suspect. And who knows, we may get the opportunity to do that this side of the elections. I did watch the Merri-bek City Council meeting last night. It was well publicised that there was an item on the agenda that may have been divisive, and it was. This was a proposal from Councillor James Conlon to explore, and I think we've got to remember they were just looking for exploring this idea of increasing rates on landlords. A doubling was what was proposed, and thereby create an opportunity to significantly reduce the rates for other ratepayers in the municipality. I think every councillor spoke to it. A couple said this is the worst or at least one, the worst motion I've ever seen come before the council, and was speechless on the matter, although managed to speak about it for a few minutes. It was ultimately passed by a vote of 6-5. So what this means, though, and some media reports have failed to get the nuance here, it doesn't mean those rates are going to double for those people as yet. It means that some work is going to be done to see whether this idea will work. And I did note the CEO, Kathy Henderson, told the meeting last night that they'd make their best efforts to get a report back this side of the election, but that may not be possible given the amount of work and the legal advice that might be needed to see whether this is actually doable. Initial thoughts on this, Nick?
Yeah, the economic advice is the interesting thing to me. I think to solve our housing crisis, we need to do a lot of things, but one of the bigger things is going to be more investment into housing. And I just can't see that putting more taxes on investors in that context is going to solve this problem. So I'm concerned about whether it's really going to help. I think some big modelling from some reputable economists might be very useful there in Merri-bek.
Yeah, Julie.
Yeah, I would agree on what Nick has just said. I think that, but good on the council for having a look at different ways in which they can distribute the rates. But I think this really needs quite a considerable amount of work before a decision's made on it. Mm.
Yes, I'd say so. I think they put an estimated cost of less than $5,000 on doing that work to bring it back. But one of the things that occurs to me here, and I'm not saying this is the right way to float an idea like this and debate it. Obviously, it's going to be explored further. But harking back to the topics we've already been discussing today, it seems like it's becoming harder and harder for an idea to be explored and discussed in today's environment. It's almost impossible, isn't it, to have a debate about anything without there being these intractable opposing sides.
People have got their own echo chambers. They love to shoot people down, and that's very unfortunate because it really hinders creative thinking.
Yeah,
sadly.
Yeah, very true. All right, so that's the Merri-bek one, which we'll keep an eye on, and if that report does come back this side of the elections, of course, we'll talk about it. There's news out of Moira Shire this week. John Tanner has stepped down as the chair of administrators there. This was part of the plan. In fact, I think he held on to the role a bit longer than he'd originally intended. Stepped down last weekend, and Dr. Graham Emonson, a former council CEO and state government executive, is now the chair of the Moira panel. I did look at the announcement very closely here, looking for some hints on whether they're going to continue as a panel of two. It feels like that's the case. There's been no mention of there being another panelist appointed, Julie.
Yeah, I think so, Chris. It sounds like it's just the two.
So that's Graham and Susanna Sheed, the former MP, who's the other administrator.
That's right. That's correct. So, look, we're really pleased to see Graham Emonson stepping into this role. He's very experienced, both in local and state government. So, a great appointment to being the chair of the administrators. I think it's only a small council, Chris. So I suspect that two administrators is probably okay. Although if you've got a split decision on something, then I assume that as the chair, you would have you would break the deadlock.
Well, yeah. So exactly the sorts of sorts of things that I was thinking through, Julie, as well. And look, if Moira was going back to election this year, you'd say that makes sense, but they're not. They're not going back to election until 2028. So it's going to be 4.5 years with two administrators, possibly, unless there's a plan to fill that other position. We just haven't been appraised of that yet.
Yeah, it's silent on that. So there is an opportunity for the government to be able to bring someone in at a later stage. They might be working on, who might be appropriate to be able to also sit in that role. So yeah, look, we are really pleased, and I think that Mr. Tanner has done a good leadership role in making sure that things were stable as he stepped in, which is great. And I know that things have certainly settled down up at Moira since that time. So John Tanner's work in that space is much appreciated, I'm sure, by the Moira staff.
It's a very long-term appointment, so it'll be 5 years, I think, by the time it's up. And I guess with that being the case, and it was likely necessary, we'll get these sorts of issues cropping up with the turnover that happens over the duration.
Yes, true, Nick. You've got some news out of the planning world this week, some engagement with the minister that's worth touching on, Julie.
Yes, that's right, Chris. It was interesting. I was reading the Planning Institute of Australia have put out a bulletin just this week, and they've basically said that they've had an opportunity to engage with Victorian government officers and also the Minister for Planning on the Plan for Victoria and other housing policy matters, which is really good to hear. The Minister apparently met with Planning Institute members from around Australia at the National Planning Congress in Melbourne that I was speaking about recently. And also there was a ministerial roundtable that was held with a broad group of Victorian members this week, and they talked about a number of different issues, employment lands, they talked about climate resilience in the built environment, planning for bushfire risk. They talked about providing statutory weight to key decisions in a plan for Victoria, and also my favourite topic, they talked about the development of better relationships with local government, Yahoo. So that was good to hear. They discussed ensuring the regions are not forgotten or overlooked in all of what is considering in terms of Plan for Victoria, unlocking and providing sufficient infrastructure for local government in particular, and the importance of governance and institutional reform from a place planning perspective. So it was really a really diverse amount of topics that they had raised at that really good ministerial roundtable discussion. And I'm only hoping that there were members from local government that were sitting at that roundtable. But one of the key themes I think that came out, Chris, which was interesting, was all about implementation, and implementation, how important that is in all of this. When they're talking about any changes. So it's okay to develop strategies, but it's the implementation on the ground that's most important. So yeah, so look, they also, the Planning Institute were able to talk and promote their Better Places, Better Housing position statement, which is an interesting read, and they've sort of been pushing that forward and challenging the economic context with the government. And they've also been pushing for a position on the need for quality and high amenity outcomes in activity centres and other precincts where there's housing development that is being, sort of targeted for major growth. So I think it's, in all of this, the planners don't want the quality and the amenity outcomes to be compromised when we're talking about massive growth in these centres, and that's what's really going to be important, I think, for local communities. So some really, really interesting and really good discussions, I think, between the Planning Institute and the Minister for Planning.
Good summary, Julie, with that plan for Victoria being developed. Can you just remind me, and sorry if I'm putting you on the spot, that's going to replace Plan Melbourne, correct, and be a statewide plan? And what's the timing we're expecting on that?
I don't know. I'll check that, Chris, and I'll update you. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's obviously work that is underway.
Yeah, I know they're trying to push it pretty hard now. But of course, there's been a lot of shuffling around of positions in the department. And there's also been some job losses in the department as well. So it'll be interesting to see what that means for delivery, what the latest is for delivery. Yeah.
Okay. Good update there. A couple of interesting stories out of interstate that we'll come to shortly, but I think it's time to bring in Rhys Thomas, which means it's time for something surprisingly interesting about councillor leaves of absence. It's time for the pièce de résistance on, does that make sense? On this week's program. Hello, Rhys Thomas. Did I butcher that, or was that right?
Well, it's becoming increasingly ridiculous, Chris. So
Yeah,
you're going to have to
idea.
let me choose the title for next week. Will you give me that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Because I'm a little concerned about this reliance on my name, because it kind of puts me in the frame.
Yeah,
Although
well,
there is an excellent governance officer down at South Gippsland called Rhys. So perhaps that can be the emergency fill-in.
Okay, you make some very good points. Of course, we've been flooded with suggestions from the audience, but we'll move you up the list for next week. Rhys, this week you promised to tell us something interesting, something perhaps surprisingly interesting about leaves of absence.
I have, Chris, because last week you'll recall on the TGU panel you talked about a councillor who lost office for failing to attend meetings.
Yes,
and I thought that was interesting because I'd always sort of wondered about the situation here in Victoria. I did a bit of digging and I've got a little bit to share about it.
Excellent. All right. What have you discovered?
Well, first of all, you probably know that Victoria's rules are different to the other states, because in Victoria, a councillor loses office if they're absent for a specified period rather than a specified number of meetings. So you might think that's not really a material difference. It was a change that happened when the 2020 Act was adopted, probably because of the removal of the distinction between ordinary and special council meetings. My guess is the drafters of the Act picked 4 months because most councils were meeting monthly, and it was as close a approximation to 4 ordinary meetings as you could get.
Right.
Now, it has advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of going for a period of time is that a councillor doesn't lose office after a short absence just because the council holds a number of meetings in quick succession. So if for some procedural reason it's necessary for a council to meet 4 times in 1 week, under the old rules, a councillor could have lost office for that. But the disadvantage is that the clock is ticking regardless of whether meetings are actually held or not.
Right. So the Christmas New Year period, for example, where you might have a 2-month stretch.
That's right. So I had a bit of a look at some council meeting schedules. In fact, there's quite a few where that period in question, there'd be only 2 meetings between the middle of December and 4 months later. So what that means is that a councillor could miss 2 meetings and go out of office. And of course, in 2020, we had the COVID experience, and for a period we couldn't actually meet electronically. And so there was an extended period where a number of councillors didn't meet. And there was a risk. I remember at the time, the council I was at, I was concerned about if it had gone on much longer, we would have been in this situation.
Right.
So I had a bit of a look at the Act, because that's the single source of truth. That's where you always go. And I think probably the most interesting thing is that there's in fact no such thing as leave of absence at all, at least not in the way we usually understand it. We think of leave of absence like a period of annual leave for a member of staff.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's not that at all. A better phrase would be leave to be absent from a meeting, where the word leave means permission. And so what a councillor is seeking when they request leave is the council's permission to be absent from council meetings for the purposes of Section 35, which is what dismisses them. None of their other rights or responsibilities as a councillor are affected by a period of leave of absence. So while councils might have in their governance rules some administrative procedures about when a councillor is on leave of absence, it might talk about things like them not having to be notified of meetings, not sending them agenda, some of the practical things, which really date back to the days when you needed to physically take an agenda to a councillor's home. But like we've talked about on TGU a number of times, it's just not possible for a councillor to take off their councillor hat and choose not to be a councillor when it suits them.
Yes.
And so that applies to leave of absence as well. So leave, in this sense, only applies to the permission to be absent from the meeting. None of the other duties of a councillor are affected.
So how then, Reece, does that differ from an apology? Because in my mind, the way it's always been treated, you would apply for a leave of absence in advance of not being present at a meeting, but you'd put in for an apology when you're not going to be at that particular meeting.
Yeah, there is a distinction, obviously, between an apology and leave, and an apology effectively has no legal standing at all. There's an interesting case from New South Wales, the New South Wales Land and Environment Court in 2020. It's called Loader versus Narrabri Shire. So it refers to a councillor, Councillor Loader, at Narrabri Shire, who had been diagnosed with cancer. And so for understandable reasons, they were unable to attend council meetings while undertaking their treatment. Now, while that councillor submitted apologies to the 3 meetings she missed, because the 3 meetings is the threshold in New South Wales, she hadn't filled out the necessary leave request form from the administration, despite having been reminded to do so. And right. She became ineligible to hold the office of council, despite the apologies. Now, she argued in court that the council, knowing those circumstances, should have accepted her situation as a request for leave and granted her leave, notwithstanding the fact that she didn't actually formally ask for it by completing the necessary form. She also argued that the council's acceptance of her apologies at the meetings should be interpreted as a grant of leave. Now, both those arguments failed, and the court found that without an express and clear grant of leave to be absent, the council couldn't hold office. So I won't go into the details of the case here, because there are failings on part of both the council and the administration in that situation, but there's some learning from it that we can take here in Victoria. And the main message, I think, is the lack of discretion in the provision that sees a councillor cease to hold office. You can't interpret it based on the vibe of the Act, what they had in mind. Leave has either been granted by resolution or it hasn't been. It's as simple as that. It's not something that can be reversed, and it's not something that can be excused due to a failure on the part of the administration.
And we've seen some examples in other states and even a close call, I think, in Victoria, where councillors have been removed from office for not having those leaves of absence formally resolved on by the council. A famous one, I think it was Kangaroo Island, where a councillor had suffered a bereavement and was unable to attend council meetings, was removed automatically because of the way the Act was worded, and then, interestingly, re-stood when there was a by-election and got the position back. Which sort of makes a bit of a mockery too. You can understand why people say this is silly, this system, can't you?
You certainly can. And you can imagine that exactly scenario happening in Victoria if a councillor was tipped out of office. And of course, with the increasing move to single member wards, vacancies are filled by by-election, which would enable a councillor to re-stand. You couldn't do it if you were in a multi-member ward and the position was filled by count back.
Yeah.
But there was a situation in Victoria that unfolded last year where a councillor submitted apologies for a number of meetings before seeking leave to be absent. So that's not an uncommon scenario in council. Perhaps someone's unwell and they don't really think to apply for leave of absence because they're not intending to be away for 4 months, but circumstances change and at some point they make that request. Now, in this council, there was some confusion because a councillor actually moved a motion to refuse the request, which is a most unusual thing for a councillor to do. And councils can't, what the Act says is councils can't unreasonably refuse the request. Now, whether or not this council was about to unreasonably refuse the request is a moot point because the motion wasn't successful.
Right.
But in the confusion, the council didn't actually grant the request. There was no second motion. So the request had to come back to the next meeting. Now, thankfully, that meeting was 3 months and 26 days after the councillor's last attendance at a council meeting. Had it been 4 days later, then it would not have been possible for that council, without an extraordinary meeting, to actually grant the leave of request, the leave of absence, and the councillor would have lost their office.
Close call, as you say. And I can imagine if a request is refused, then there's going to be a lot of argy-bargy about the meaning of unreasonable, which is probably another rabbit hole to go down.
And in fact, the very fact that a councillor sought to refuse that request opens up the possibility of what happens if a council is behaving somewhat mischievously. So imagine a scenario where a councillor, where I described earlier, there's only 2 meetings in a 4-month period at Christmas. Imagine a councillor is absent from the first of those meetings, and then the councillor, perhaps out of favour with their colleagues, is intending to attend that second meeting. What if the other councillors simply didn't attend, deprived the meeting of a quorum, and there would neither be an opportunity to attend the meeting or request the leave of absence at the meeting? I don't know what would happen in that situation.
You have a devious mind.
I think the minister would probably take some interest, to be honest.
Yeah, I would think so. All right, look, dare I say, Reece, that was surprisingly interesting again.
What's the advice, Chris?
I was going to say, what's the upshot of all this for governance managers and for councillors?
There's 3 things for governance officers to remember. That in order to be watertight, a leave of absence should have these 3 characteristics. First of all, it should have been requested by the councillor, because unless it's requested by the councillor, then the trigger that prevents the council from unreasonably refusing it doesn't apply. So if your practice is to just automatically treat an absence as a request of leave, but in the absence of an actual formal request, then your councillor wouldn't be bound to grant it. Your council wouldn't be. So it's got to have a request. It must be granted by the council, not noted or simply recorded in the meeting minutes. So I've had a bit of a look back at some minutes of some councils in the last week, and I've seen words like endorse, acknowledge, record, not the word grant. The word grant is the one in the Act, and if I was a governance officer, that's the one I'd be using.
Wow.
The other thing is the request should relate to council meetings, not to a period of time. So this is a pretty common thing. Councils will grant a leave of absence from the 1st of July through to the 5th of September.
Saw one just like that this week, actually.
You'll see lots of them.
Date to another
it's
date.
Very normal. But there's no mention of the actual council meetings. It's my view that the motion should say something like, seek leave of absence for, and either list the actual specific meetings that are scheduled, or it should say for all council meetings between 1st of July and 5th of September, leaving it no longer open to interpretation, that it clearly refers to the meetings, but also avoiding the interpretation that the councillor is somehow on leave from all of their other rights and responsibilities, which is not something that a councillor can step away from.
Okay.
Now, in Victoria, unlike some of the other states, a grant of leave can be retrospective. The Act doesn't say that you can't do it after the event, but it couldn't happen after the 4 months had passed, because at that point, the councillor would no longer be a councillor, and you can't undo that part of it.
Yes.
But if you were 2 months in, you could grant a leave of absence dating back to the beginning of that period. Now, the other piece of advice, and the last message I've got for you today, is for councillors, and it's this: don't apply or don't send apologies to council meetings. It's as simple as that. Right. In my view, you should request a leave of absence at each and every meeting that you are unable to attend, simply because you don't know what the future holds. You don't know if there'll be another pandemic. You don't know if you'll be unwell. You don't know if you'll be uncontactable. You might go missing in the bush for 3 months and turn up later, only to discover you're no longer a councillor, simply because you thought you would be at the 2nd and 3rd month meetings. Why not apply for a leave of absence for every meeting? Some councils already do that. Every councillor, every absence is recorded as a leave of absence. So that's my advice.
I did not know that. This is dangerously becoming useful, this segment, Reece. Thank you very much for that on leaves of that. Who knew? Who knew that could be so interesting? Before I let you go, how's the board election going?
Well, it's going really well, actually. The ballot papers are due back in by Tuesday next week. We've had a very strong turnout, which was actually a bit of a surprise to us. In the year of a council election, we wonder whether people have gotten a little bit of election fatigue. Yeah. But certainly the councillors at the VLGA councils obviously don't, because they've been casting their votes. So those councillors that haven't yet done that, you want to have a say, you want to be part of the organisation and find some councillors that represent you. So pull out your ballot paper, have a bit of a look, and cast your vote.
Excellent. All right. Look forward to hearing the outcome from that. Reece, we're going to have to let you go. That's been terrific. Thank you. And I look forward to hearing what special name you've got for the segment in mind for next week.
I'll rack my brains, Chris. See you then.
Thank you, Reece. Reece Thomas there with us with our VLGA snapshot for this week. As I said, Julie and Nick, it's becoming very useful, that segment and that advice that the sector's getting from Reece each week here on TGU. Who would have thought?
That's right. It's great to have someone so passionate about local government sitting at the table and having a chat to Chris Eddy, who knows how to get the most out of the people that he interviews.
Is that right? Okay. Thank you for the vote of confidence. Let's look at a couple of other stories from outside of Victoria that have caught our eye this week. Nick, I'm interested in hearing your take on this one. I'm not sure I've ever heard of a council being ordered to pay back grant money, certainly not in the amounts we're talking about here that's impacting Hornsby Shire Council in New South Wales. The government has said, we want your $36 million back that you haven't yet spent on a particular project. The Shire is, let's say, sort of liberal leaning because the mayor is Philip Ruddock, the former federal minister. He's said to be furious. This project was due to start later this year, and the government's saying you've got to give the money back. Have you ever heard of a situation like this, Nick?
It is remarkable. $36 million. I think the original grant was $40 million, and there has been a long delay in getting the project started. I think Mayor Ruddock has indicated that some work has actually commenced, some physical work. He's explained that there were a range of delays due to COVID. Now, we've heard that. I think it's important to look at the political context here, and there is some partisanship, and you've alluded to that. The former Premier of New South Wales, indeed, who was responsible for handing out this grant, Gladys Berejiklian, she herself has admitted that there was some serious partisanship in the grant scheme that happened here. And Philip Ruddock doesn't have too many friends on the other side of politics. I think it's fair to say he might have used to have had, but that's diminished over time. So it's a really unfortunate situation. He has highlighted the need for recreation facilities in his area and indicated that they have much less than they should. So it's really unfortunate that it's got to this. One would hope that wiser heads would prevail, but I'm not sure that's going to happen.
No, they seem entrenched, don't they? So this money came from a grant program which was meant to support merged councils. Apparently some of those merged councils didn't get the level of support that Liberal national areas did. That's the allegation that's been made. Darcy Byrne's certainly one that's made that allegation, the Mayor of Inner West, who this week said this is appropriate that the government claws back that money and perhaps you can give it to us because we weren't even allowed to apply for grants under the program. So there's that partisanship that you're talking about there, Nick. Pretty extraordinary, though, Julie, to have a project on the books, ready to go, and then to have the rug pulled out from under you this way.
Look, Chris, this is not unusual. I've seen this before and it's happened in Victoria. I'm not going to name names, but I know that the government do look at the status of these projects and they monitor the status of these projects that rely on government funding. And I think that's one thing that the councils need to be really aware of, is that they will be monitored in terms of how well they're progressing. And there have been decisions that have been made by the Victorian state government to take away funding where councils have not spent the money in the required time. Or what they do is if they're too slow, they impact their own reputation with the state government in future funding allocations. So just think about that in terms of if you want to get a good reputation for delivery, then you need to deliver on, the funding that's been put forward, and be realistic when you're putting in your application for funding that you can deliver and you have got the resources to be able to deliver. So it should only be in extraordinary or exceptional circumstances where that doesn't get delivered, like in a COVID situation.
Practical advice, Julie. I think a couple of other councils like Hornsby had asked for the permission to reallocate money under that program and were denied. Federation Council was one of those, but there were a few others that asked for reallocations or extensions of time and were granted. The Office of Local Government in New South Wales has put out that information this week. I was reminded, Nick, when you were talking about the former Premier Gladys Berejiklian and how in the media they always used to call it the Berejiklian government when they were making an announcement. You know, they usually put the name of the Premier. Someone very close to me who's not politically savvy and is not at all interested in politics said to me, "Where's Berejiklian?"
Well, of course, we can.
Sounds like a very exotic place.
It does.
We know, of course, where Gladys's family is from just by the ending on her surname. Armenian, I understand. The IAN, yes. Anyway,
there you go.
You learn something every day.
Yes.
Thanks, Nick.
A font of knowledge, Nick.
Indeed. Julie, Brisbane City Council are looking to change their meeting rules, and there's been a little bit of argy-bargy about this. They want to reduce the speaking time in the chamber. Now, let's put some context here. There's 26 councillors, I think, and at the moment they're able to speak for 10, this is in their committee meetings, 10 minutes each on a particular item. So do the math. Makes for very long meetings. They're looking to cut those speaking times in half, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting when I think back when I worked at Westminster City Council, how many councillors there were in the council meeting. It was something like 65 or 70. And I was thinking, gee, I can't remember how long they were able to speak for, but I'm going to have a look at that one and see. But yeah, look, it's the Liberal National Party administration that's proposed these new rules for Brisbane City that will mean councillors will have less time for speeches and debating motions. So the Liberal National Party says that the move will ensure more family-friendly hours for council employees. Isn't this interesting? This is a trend. It's a trend this week in the news. Have you heard about this, you know, family-friendly hours and how there's new legislation apparently coming in where you can't contact your employee after certain outside office hours unless there's exceptional circumstances or whatever. So I've sort of drew a bit of a line between those two, but I don't think that's what this is related to. But anyway, but they're wanting more family-friendly hours, not as long meetings, because apparently they start at like 1 o'clock in the afternoon and they go till late into the evening. So
I'm not surprised.
Yes, I know. And they're also their current rules also allow for councillors to raise an unlimited number of notices of motion to debate in the council chamber with no specific time restriction on the length of debate. So what's going to change, Chris? Well, councillors will have their speaking times halved during general business from 10 minutes to 5 minutes. And the councillors will be allowed to speak longer than 5 minutes, but only if there's a resolution of council. So they'll have to resolve to allow them to go longer. Debate time and notices of motion brought forward by the opposition councillors will also be limited to 1 hour, while majority councillors will be barred from bringing forward any motions. So that's interesting.
Okay.
Now, the Deputy Mayor Adams said the proposed changes would be subject to public consultation after approval by the council. So it looks like they're going to put it out for public view, which is interesting. I don't know how many people are really going to be interested in providing feedback on that. I think, you know, I don't know. It sort of seems to me to be maybe a little bit over the top, but I don't know.
Well, and I would have thought, you know, the answer. Most people would think if they've ever watched a council meeting that they talk too much anyway.
Yeah, maybe.
Just one different perspective on this. Obviously, the population serviced by Brisbane City Council is huge, 2 million or more. And those rules are now more restrictive than apply in the Parliament of the state of Tasmania, which has a population that's less than a quarter the size.
Wow.
So that sort of does give a different perspective, doesn't it?
It does. It does, Nick. That's why we have you here.
Yeah, well, that's right. And did you know, guys, that Brisbane City Council is Australia's biggest local government authority? Did you know that?
Well and truly, yes.
With a population roughly the same as Tasmania, Northern Territory and the ACT combined. So it is pretty big.
I think the biggest
26 councillors, to tell you the truth.
I think the biggest few are in Queensland. Gold Coast might be second. In terms of size of population. Don't quote me on that. But yes, for quite some time, Brisbane has been the largest. All right, so we'll watch that one with interest. Councillor speaking times. Another one out of Queensland this week that we've been keeping an eye on is a photo scandal at Toowoomba Regional Council. This is where a photo of a councillor prior to the elections in March was circulated. This councillor, Councillor Kerry Shine, appeared to be asleep in the council meeting. The picture got circulated on social media. Some have suggested it was obviously an attempt to discredit that person during an election campaign. There's been a lot of conjecture and speculation about who took the photo, who distributed it. And finally, this week, the Deputy Mayor of the Council, Rebecca von Hoff, has announced that she has referred herself to the Office of the Independent Assessor and admitted that she was the one who took the photo. She says she's not the one who distributed it. Somebody else has done that on social media, but she did take the photo and she's apologised to Councillor Shine. So there'll be a sequel to this story because the integrity body has now been asked to look into it.
It's a little bit sad. It's just bringing discredit on the apparently dozing off councillor and also the photographing councillor. It's unfortunate.
It raises questions about the relationships between all of those councillors, doesn't it? Some of the stuff we were talking about earlier today.
Yeah, if you respected someone, would you actually do that? Would you partake in that kind of activity?
All right, another cautionary tale. We note that Councillor Linda Scott at the City of Sydney and also the President of ALGA, the Australian Local Government Association, has announced that she's not renominating for Labor pre-selection and therefore won't be standing for council after a number of terms, I think, including some time as Deputy Mayor. So, a strong leader in the sector. She's been out there, particularly through the COVID years, advocating very strongly on behalf of the sector nationwide. And she'll be a loss to the sector, but congratulations to her for the enormous effort that she's put in over those years.
And again, you can see all the wonderful comments that are coming through LinkedIn congratulating her, and she's leaving a huge legacy for local government and for women in local government. She started in that role when her children were very young, and she's really made a legacy in that time that she's been in local government. So well done to her.
Absolutely. There's been an audit of Western Australian Council's IT preparedness, which has got some interesting observations that I think all councils would probably do well to take a look at. It's not painted a pretty picture of the state of particularly some of those smaller councils, I think, Julie, where one council's got its entire system running on one server.
Yes, I know, with no vendor agreement on how it could be replaced in a disaster, Chris. So, terrible situation, really. Whilst the council had a disaster plan that called for a 48-hour server replacement, it failed to specify on, how this was going to be done. They had no hardware specification with its third-party vendor, which would enable them to recover. So it sort of looked okay on the surface, but digging down deeper by the auditors has uncovered this untenable position, really, that the council's in. So there's a lot of work to be done over there, and I think this would be an interesting one for councils to have a look at, to learn from, and make sure that councils, particularly some of the smaller councils, are not in the same situation as these councils in WA. I'm not too sure. I haven't seen this kind of audit in more recent years in local government in Victoria. Don't recall seeing that. Maybe that's something that might come forward after what's been found here. Don't know.
So, IT is just such a key risk these days for all organisations. Councils are critical to the communities that they serve, and it's disturbing that they haven't done the hard work that's required to really have a robust plan. These days, it's really just a matter of being professional and modern to be on top of these issues. So it's disappointing.
Yeah, look, it's a level of maturity, I guess, that we'd expect from having worked in larger councils, which is not always the case in smaller councils with far more limited resources. So that's why these are learning experiences, and I'd be recommending this report be placed on the agenda of audit and risk committees around the country, basically, to have a look at it and at least ask some questions about how those individual councils are sitting in relation to those issues.
Yeah, good idea, Chris.
Good one to note. Story out of the UK for you, Julie, before we finish, because we know you like something from the motherland. The Local Government Association of the UK has put out some research that has found it's actually put a number on the funding gap for UK councillors, and it says in the next 2 years there's going to be an existential crisis unless something fundamental changes. The funding gap is £6.2 billion. That's an eye-watering number.
It is. And a recent LGA survey found that 2/3 of councils have already had to make cutbacks to local neighbourhood services this year for 24-25, including waste collections, road repairs, library and leisure services, as they struggle to plug the funding gaps, Chris. It's not good, is it?
No, it's not.
Wow, they are in bother. So,
and of course, the context here is there's a general election just weeks away, and the sector's scrambling to advocate for what it needs with a likely change of government. Of course, they're looking for the whoever takes government after is it the 4th of July, somewhere around there. Hopefully, has a plan to support the closest level of government to the people.
Absolutely, Chris.
It's going to be very interesting. And of course, local government in the UK had that big scale back when the austerity budgets were introduced to stuff the GFC, the Conservative and LDP, the Lib Dem alliance that came in, coalition that came in. They introduced a huge amount of cutbacks, which affected local government and the social services that local government delivers. Yeah, it's a further scale back is really what's happening here. And I think my impression is that local government in the UK is perhaps even more at the coalface of social services delivery than is the case here. They're much more involved in housing, as we know, than is the case in Australia. And I think other social services is probably the case as well.
Yeah, and I think they're the big problem areas in terms of the dollars that they're just, or the pounds that they're just soaking up, and councillors is getting further and further in the red. All right, another one to keep an eye on. Now, before we go, this is out of the Don't Try This at Home file, a cautionary tale for any councillor who is watching. If you're going to dial into a council meeting, don't do what Cesar Meyer did. He was the 3-time mayor of Rio de Janeiro. He's a councillor still at 78 years of age. He logged into a Zoom meeting last week, and it became very obvious that he was logging in from his toilet. He was sitting on the toilet. You could see that quite clearly until he apparently adjusted his camera, and the chair of the meeting actually said, "I think you should turn your camera off, Councillor Meyer." So as I say, Nick's got the giggles.
Just beyond embarrassing, isn't it?
Beyond embarrassing. Yeah.
And of course, it's created a storm online, hasn't it, Chris?
A big surprise. It's gone viral, as we say.
Oh, it's gone viral. And, the reputation of local government tarnished again because of a silly mistake that's been made. And we are going to protect our viewers from having a look at any of the images that have been posted online.
we don't need to show
because you don't need to be subjected to that. But just a warning, just to make sure that you're working in a space, and when you're on video, make sure that it's a space of serenity and appropriateness.
Well, with a green screen.
Just simply don't join an online meeting from your toilet or your bathroom. I mean, it's a pretty obvious rule,
right.
isn't it?
We don't want dunny cam, do we?
So the story that revealed this, I think it was a UK site called Metro, starts to talk about other examples of people dialing in from unfortunate places, like the man who'd been suspended from driving, who was caught logging in for his court hearing from the driver's seat of his car. So, Nick, as a lawyer, you'd find that one quite bemusing, I'm sure.
I'm tempted to play with that Abraham Lincoln line about fooling some of the people all the time, and turning that around and saying some of the people can be fools all of the time, and something like that. But
yes,
there's always a fool to be had, perhaps.
There always
That's
is
really
a
made
fool.
my week, Chris. That
Yeah.
story has made my week. That's got to be one of the worst stories we've had this year.
So I think my work here is done. Julie, we should quit while we're ahead.
We should.
Put the lid down.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you, thank you, Nick. We'll see you
Yes,
again
Chris.
next week for TGU. Great to have you with us as always. And thank you to Hunt and Hunt Lawyers, our sponsors. Thanks to Rhys Thomas again for his extremely interesting contributions. More of that next week, including another special title. We'll give up on this at some point, I think, but we're still having too much fun. And I hope you're having fun following along there at home, whether it's on YouTube or on your podcast player. And we look forward to having you back with us for our next episode. Until then, bye for now.